Now, my favourite book isn't Alice in Wonderland. It's my nearly favourite book, but my absolute top favourite book has got to be Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There. It's the next book after Wonderland, and the reason it's my favourite book of all time is obviously the pictures, which are just as good as Alice in Wonderland. There's some brilliant, brilliant illustrations in the original book. But the reason I love it, even more than Wonderland, is that it's got some brilliant poems in it. And it's got two of my favourite ever poems written by anyone. And the first one is Jabberwocky. Wonderful, wonderful, crazy poem. And the other one is The Walrus and the Carpenter. And I've loved those two poems so much that I've actually incorporated them into some of the books that I've written. So I've used A Walrus and a Carpenter in one of my mermaid books, and I've also used the Jabberwocky in books that I've written. So it's got to be Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There. The first book I remember reading, like properly reading, as a child, was, well, it wasn't Peter and Jane. Peter and Jane were, it was a reading scheme, Ladybird reading scheme that I had at my school. And they were carefully numbered from 1A or, 2B, 3B, just so that you could check on your sort of progress when you learnt to read. And so I struggled learning to read, and I struggled with Peter and Jane a lot. And I remember being stuck at about 2B in the Peter and Jane series and going into another classroom and seeing this amazing book on the table. And I looked at it, and it was Peter and Jane 12C. And I looked at this amazing book and I thought, wow, if only I could get from Peter and Jane 2B all the way up to Peter and Jane 12C, I will have learnt to do this really difficult task, which was called learning to read. And then I need never read another book again. And then out of the corner of my eye, I saw another book, and it had a really interesting cover. And it was a detective with big curly moustache and a bloodhound, a wrinkly-faced dog next to him, who was eating a cream cake. And in the background, there were some characters running out of a wood. It was a very interesting cover. And I found out much, much later that it was illustrated by an illustrator called Quentin Blake. And I looked at that cover and I thought, wow, that looks really interesting. That's not Peter and Jane. So I picked this book up and I borrowed it, and it was called Agaton Sax and the Jewel Thieves. And I took it home with me because I loved the pictures. And I sat down and tried to read the book. And it took me a very, very long time. But I wanted something in that book, and that something was called the story. I wanted to discover the story. And it wasn't Peter and Jane, it was a real story. And at the end, I finally got to the end of that book, and I just loved it. I had such a brilliant time discovering the story through the pictures, through the words, that I went back to my teacher and said, are there any more books like this? And she showed me a whole shelf full of Agaton Sax stories, and other stories as well with lots of pictures in them. And from that day on, I became a reader because I wanted to discover the stories that these books contained. If I could illustrate any book, it's one of those questions that's so difficult because I have yet to meet a book I didn't love. There are just so many fantastic books out there. I love classic fairy tales. I love myths and legends. I love the Arthurian legend. That's a brilliant one. Thing is, I've illustrated an Arthurian legends book. I've illustrated the great Don Quixote. I love doing that. I've illustrated Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass. So lots of classic books. Gulliver's Travels, absolutely loved illustrating that. I think the one book I would love to illustrate, that I almost had a chance to illustrate, but it fell through, was the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. And I've always rather sort of missed not being able to illustrate that. It was a commercial decision. They decided they couldn't sell the too many of those books, but it was a wonderful retelling by a writer called Gillian Cross. And as the years go past, I often think about Canterbury Tales and how brilliant it would be to illustrate those amazing stories. So maybe one day I'll get to actually illustrate it.